Well, a big welcome, not to Central Chapter, but to everybody statewide and perhaps even beyond our borders for this, the first virtual presentation of the Oklahoma Native Plant Society. It used to be the Central Chapter, but this is not Central Chapter. We took a vote after a debate. We had a 51-49 split. We decided to let the eastern half of the state join us as well as everybody else. So welcome to these COVID times. Our Central Chapter meetings are now open to the entire statewide audience. A couple of shout outs. First off to Adam Ryburn, who is our webmaster. He wears lots of hats, including working for the Oklahoma Academy of Sciences, as well as chairing the department at Oklahoma City University. He took time to make this happen, and Adam, we greatly appreciate that. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'll tell you one of the things she does. She works at the Sam Noble Museum in Norman in the paleobotany section, which just happens to coincide with a paleobotanist will be giving our presentation the first Thursday of November, and we'll have another virtual meeting in November, and probably we'll take December and January off for the holidays. We'll resume in February, presumably with a virtual meeting, and then depending on the status of where this country is and where Oklahoma is, we'll make some decisions on whether to go forward with further virtual meetings or actually resume in-person meetings. If you have others that you know that were interested in tonight's meeting, but they couldn't, tune in at 7 o'clock. Or if you just feel like you didn't get enough the first time and you want to go back a second time, this will be on our website and will be able to be reviewed at your convenience. Our speaker tonight is Ramona Thompson. She's a longtime ONPS member. She is a retired professor at East Central University. By the way, that was my alma mater, Ramona.
Oh, really?
East Central State College. 25 years at East Central in botany and biology. Since retirement, she's moved on to the Cleveland County Master Gardeners, does a lot of volunteer work, and is graciously agreed to be the first speaker of this, our inaugural virtual meeting. So on behalf of the Oklahoma Native Plant Society, welcome to all. I hope you enjoy our presentation. Ramona?
All right. I am going to share my screen and bring up the PowerPoint. Somehow, am I there? Are you seeing me?
I don't see you yet.
Something happened.
Okay, let me just make sure here. Well, you should be able to do it.
I'm back. Share screen. It's not showing the PowerPoint, which I had earlier. Basic files. Nope. Of course. Let me bring it up. Well,
like when you click on shared screen, you should get several different options, right?
Yep. And this is not there. Okay, lower it. Of course it worked while we were doing this.
We did do a test run, folks, so just bear with us. I think we can get this worked out.
Basic files, Google Drive.
While Ramona is working on finding her shared screen, I'll let the audience know that for those of you, okay, so Ramona has started the shared screen. There it is, Ramona. I'll
There
let the audience know that if you have questions during the presentation, down at the bottom of your screen at the ONPS website, you should be able to type in a question and submit it. If we have time at the end of this, Adam will then read those and Ramona will respond. Otherwise, if we do run short of time, then there may be a written response. But if you have questions, be sure and enter them. Okay, Ramona.
All right. So as you gather in your garden, enjoying the flowers that you've cared for, the vegetables that you're growing, the friends that you brought in to enjoy your garden, you need to realize there's more going on around you than what you suspect. There's sex going on in your flower bed. So now there we go. We have often personalized flowers, frequently in a feminine form. And we oftentimes have given them a secret meaning. You've seen the books, The Secret Language of Flowers. Well, here's a joke that goes along with it. So Frank and Ernest, they're saying for Valentine's Day, we want to send a cactus to our acupuncturist, some mums to the librarian, and bachelor buttons to all our unmarried friends. But in reality, what the florists are hoping to sell you is lots of romantic flowers that you give in love and affection, oftentimes hoping with some intimacy that might be the result of your gift. Now, it's not, the flowers are about sex, but it's not about human sex. And this past botany professor from long ago really struggled with how to teach botany because it was far too promiscuous for students to be hearing. Because, as I said earlier, flowers are a four-parted sexual organ system. We have at the bottom sepals, above that is petals, then stamens, followed by pistils. So the pistils are the outer and lowermost part of the organ of the flower. And they protect the flower when it's closed and in bud. And if it's one of those flowers that closes every night, it might not be open when Morty is showing a picture of it. Here is a citrus flower, ornamental citrus flower, and on the outside you see the petals, you see the sepals, which are protecting the petals. Here is a fuchsia flower, and instead of being the typical green sepals, they are also serving as an attractive unit by being pink, but they're still on the outside doing protection. Petals are typically the attractive part of the flower. They're above the sepals, and they can be quite large and colorful and boisterous, such as in this Eustoma exaltatum or prairie gentian, or this rock rose, cistus, a cultivated cistus, which has large, beautiful petals. The perianth plus is a term for the sepals plus the petals. So oftentimes you'll see both of them together at the same time, and we talk about them as a unit. Here is a hibiscus, ornamental hibiscus with red petals and green sepals, and collectively the two are called the perianth. Sometimes the petals and the sepals look very similar, and then they get called tepals. Here is an orange, whoops, I went too fast. Here is an orange daylily, Hymericallus fulva, that has 3 petals. There's 1, 2, 3. Notice they're a little bit higher than this 1, 2, 3 sepals, but they look very similar, so they're all acting as an attractive unit. Here is a Zapranthus, ornamental Zapranthus, a rain lily, and it's doing the same thing. There are 3 lower sepals that look very, very similar to the 3 upper petals. I can talk about there being 6 tepals there. Stamens are above the sepals and the petals. They're composed of 2 parts, a filament, which is the stalk that supports the anther, and the anther that produces the pollen. On this ornamental plum, you can see the white filaments with the anthers that have already shed pollen. Here's some anthers that haven't shed pollen, but there are lots of stamens in this ornamental plum. Here's a close-up of a stamen, filament, anther at the top with the pollen grains coming out. And if I do a cross section through here, this is what it looks like. The whole thing is an anther. It's got 4 spaces in it. Inside each space are the pollen grains. If you do a higher magnification of the pollen grains, you will see each pollen grain has 2 cells in it. One of these cells will divide and produce 2 sperm. So when you have hay fever, you've got plant sperm up your nose. The pistil is the uppermost, the top organ of the flower, and it is composed of 3 parts. You've got a stigma, which is where the pollen lands. You've got a style, which is connective, and you've got the ovary at the base, which contains the ovules. And notice the way pistil is spelled. It's spelled with an I, not an O. So if you were a student of mine and you wrote down and labeled the plant part with an O, P-I-S-T-O-L, my response was, you got it wrong, because this is not a firearm. Here is Love in the Mist, Nigella damascensis. It has a pistil here. It's got 5 beautiful styles. At the tip of each is a stigma and a big, nice ovary. Here is a Camineuron angustifolium, a fireweed. It has parted stigmas right here. There are 4 of them, with a long style that runs back past the petals and the sepals and into an ovary that is beneath the petals and the sepals. That provides some extra protection. If you cut through an ovary, you can see all the ovules. And notice this little spot right in here. If we look at higher magnification, you can see the ovule, and there's that little region. That is the embryo sac. And when you do a really high magnification of the embryo sac, there you have an egg waiting to be pollinated by a sperm. Once there's been pollination and fertilization, you eventually get a seed. Here are some seeds within the mature ovary. And that mature ovary we call a fruit. So here on these tomato fruits, you've got leftover sepals. The stem that held all the flowers is still attached. On this apple, developing apple, Malus domestica, you still have some of the petals and this leftover stamens. beneath some flowers, there's also an additional organ, and this can be called a bract. And some of the flowers, it's an red arrow. They're not very flowers. Is red bract. Over here on poinsettia, you have these ugly little flowers, or inflorescences actually. And hopefully this is continuing. My internet was unstable for a minute. You have these red bracts, which is what you pay good money for on your poinsettia. You don't pay your money for these ugly little flowers. This is a species that you can find out around Ada, Oklahoma, Cornus, Florida. These are the flowers. There are 4 bracts on this dogwood. Now, we start noticing that there's lots of variation in types of flowers. And the most simple is a complete flower, and it's got all 4 of the organs. It's got the petals, the sepals, the stamens, and the pistil. And it's complete. So here is a mustard. This is a borrowed slide, so I don't know what mustard it is. And you've got sepals here, petals there. Here are stamens. This is a complete flower. If you've got a complete flower on an hour, you're one of the types of organs, one of the types of floral organs. It doesn't matter which one, be minus more than one, but you've at least missing one. So here is Juncus balticus, rush. We got sepals, stamens, and a pistil with absolutely beautiful red styles. It's an incomplete flower because there are no petals. A perfect flower has both sexual whorls. And by sexual whorls, I mean stamens and pistils. I'm not talking about the petals and the sepals when I talk about a perfect flower. I'm only talking about whether both the stamens and the pistils are there. Anything could be going on here. They both could be there. They both could be absent, or one or more, one of them may be present. Here is a Lycophyllum frutescens, or Texas sage. It does have sepals. It does have the petals you can see, but this is a perfect flower because there's the style and stigma of the pistil. Here's one, there's a second, a third, and a 4th stamen. So it is a perfect flower. Magnolia grandiflora, large flowering magnolia. There's some question as to whether these are all petals or all sepals or a combination of both, but that doesn't matter because this is a perfect flower. Excuse me. I've got stamens right here, and there are the stigmas of the pistils. An imperfect flower is minus one of the sexual whorls. Doesn't matter about the petals and the sepals. All I'm talking about is the pistils and the stamens. So in begonia, cultivated begonia, I have flowers here that have anthers, but there's no pistil. Over here, I have rudimentary anthers that are not functional, but there's the ovary of the pistil. So these are staminate flowers. These are pistillate flowers. The advantage of having incomplete flowers is you have to have cross-pollination. That brings us to another variation of what can go on. Monoecious plants. Monoecious plants are plants that have imperfect flowers of both kinds, those that have stamens and those that have pistils on the same plant. Mono meaning one, ishi being house, one house. Corn is a monoecious plant. Up at the top, you have the tassels, the staminate flowers, and down below the tassels, you have the ear, which is a whole bunch of pistillate flowers. They're not together in each, the sex organs are not in the same flower. You only have staminate flowers at the top and pistillate flowers down below. This is a really, really weird spurge, euphorbia. I don't know what it is because it is a borrowed slide. And when we're looking at our bracts, these are nectaries, which produce nectar. And I have a staminate flower here. It's an incomplete, imperfect flower. There are no petals, there are no sepals. There's only one stamen that makes up this flower. Same goes here. This is a pistillate flower. No sepals, just a pistil, okay? All of these together make up an inflorescence, and I have attractive bracts. So this is an incomplete, imperfect flower. This is an incomplete, imperfect flower also, but they're on the same plant, so it's monoecious. So if you have monoecious, that means you've got to have something else. Dioecious plant is a plant, dio, two, eicious, house, where you have a plant with just one type of flower, staminate and pistillate. This is willow. Here's a staminate plant with flowers that only produce stamens. This is a pistillate plant with flowers that only produce pistils. We go back to our begonias. You've got the same sort of thing going on with the begonia. You have the staminate flowers only on staminate plants, and you have the pistillate flowers only on pistillate plants. So these are dioecious. All of this has big implications for pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from an anther to the stigma of a style on a pistil. If you're going to have sexual reproduction, that means you've got to have pollination. And there are two types. There's self-pollination. When you do it to yourself, that pollen from the stamens in your flower land up on the stigma in the style of and the pistil of the same flower. Cross-pollination is pollination between flowers. There are some advantages for self-pollination. If you're weedy, if there's very few of you out there, and you can produce seeds and fruits without the means of a companion, you're a pretty good weed. Cross-pollination, however, increases genetic diversity. So this is the much more common situation. There are plants that can do both. This is a speedwell. I don't know what Veronica it is, but it's a very small plant, grows early in the spring. Generally, you've got cool days, warming up a little bit, very cool nights, and the pollinators may not be out and around. It has a style with a stigma coming up through here, anthers sitting on top of filaments of stamens, and the stamen is curved so that the anther is depositing pollen on the stigma. Pollination is a pretty iffy thing if you're growing early in the spring. So to be able to self-pollinate ensures that you continue your lineage. However, lots of plants have a temporal spacing between development of their stigmas and development of the pollen in the anthers. This is a maypop, a Passiflora incarnata. And here we have the stigmas up in the air. The stamens with the anthers are bending downward. Right here at the base of the style are little fibers that are hiding nectaries. So the bee will come in, forage around, get a lot of pollen on its back, and fly off. Once the pollen's gone from the anthers, then the styles start drooping. The bee still comes in, forages for nectar, and it whaps the stigmas with its back that are covered with pollen from a flower that was in a different stage. So cross-pollination occurs instead of self-pollination. Now, cross-pollination can be achieved by biotic or abiotic means. Biotic, we're talking about wind or weather. That was abiotic. Biotic, we're talking about an animal. And animals can be vertebrates or invertebrates. And when we're talking invertebrates, we're talking insects, vertebrates, bats, flying foxes, birds, and then there's some other things that go on. Let's talk about wind pollination. We're in Oklahoma where the wind comes sweeping down the plain and you get lots of wind. Here are oaks, not the same oak. You get the staminate flowers all together in an inflorescence called a tassel. The wind comes blowing through, spreads all that oak on the wind, gives people hay fever because they've got sperm up their nose. And some of it will land on the little bitty, incomplete, imperfect flowers that are near the leaves on the stem. Usually they're back a little ways on the stem. But this is a pistillate oak flower. This is another pistillate oak flower. Not much of anything, but it makes a pretty darn good acorn. Here are plantains or plantago, showing off all their little male sex organs, waving them out in the wind, for the pollen to come up. Once these fall off, then the stigmas start emerging and it can be pollinated by another plant. Grasses are very, very important in Oklahoma. They belong to the plant family Poaceae. Here is a Tripsicum dactyloides or eastern gamma grass. All of these are anthers hanging out of flowers. Down here, we have stigmas hanging out of some other flowers. Grasses are highly evolved to have basically very little but the sex organs. Here's another grass. We have the stamens, long, thin filament that can wave in the wind, big anthers to shed lots of pollen, and feathery stigmas. If we dissect one of the flowers out and look at it, you have 3 stamens, big anthers. You have 2 feathery stigmas, the ovaries back in behind here. And these are little structures that might be derived from sepals, but that's all there is to a grass flower. It's beautifully designed for wind pollination. Now, true water pollination happens at or underneath the water. There are few tropical plants that do this, but in Oklahoma, our aquatic plants usually stick their flowers up above the water, such as in this Nufar lutea or yellow water lily. So this would be pollinated by insects. This would not be an abiotic pollination because the flower is above water. If you get into some weird tropical things, you can read some neat stories, but not going to happen in Oklahoma. So if you're relying on a living organism to move your pollen grains to the stigmas of your pistil, you generally have to provide some kind of reward. And the common rewards are pollen, nectar, or oils or proteins. This is a Comelina communis, or widow's tears, or dayflower. It has an interesting strategy in that it has feeding anthers right up here, and then 2 stamens down here that have pollinating anthers. Here's the stigma and style leading back to the pistil. And notice it's in line with the pollinating anthers. So the insect comes in here, has lunchtime, dinner time, gets whacked on the bottom half, underneath side, gets some pollen on there, flies to the next flower, brushes the pollen of the stigma on that next flower, and it pollinates it. This was its reward. Here's the plum again, the ornamental plum. And you can see this lovely little bowl that produces a lot of nectar in here. So the insect will come in, go brushing around, lapping up the nectar. And what you can't, it's hard to see, is there's a stigma in the style. So it will brush up against it. This is an interesting plant. This is Senna marilandica, or Indian senna, or wild senna. And it has feeding anthers and pollinating anthers also, but it also produces extra floral nectaries. You can see this ant getting nectar off of it. So nectaries are not always with the flower. They don't always have to do with pollination. Sometimes it's a little bit of protection, keeping the other herbivores off, or sometimes it's enticing an ant. An ant might be the pollinator. This is Impatiens capensis, touch me not, or jewel weed. It has a nectar spur. So you're looking at the bottom side of the flower. They're the sepals. And there's a long tube, and down in here, the nectar is produced. So the insect or the bird or whatever has to penetrate way down in here to get the nectar. Aquilegia, or red columbine, also has nectar spurs. Right here, you have this tube. The nectar is produced down in here. It fills up the tube, and so quite a treat for the pollinator. This is a cultivated pouch orchid. And it, as well as some of the other orchids, will catch fluids in here. The insect will fall in here. It will be scraping along in here to get oils, scratch oils off of the surface of this lip. This lower petal is called a lip. fall down in here, and that when it climbs out, it manages to pollinate. Some of these pouch orchids produce oils that the bees use to make pheromones to attract female bees. There can also be some protein sometime in this instead of oils. Now, if you're going to produce a reward, you need to show the pollinator that this is where you need to move. This is where you need to go. This is an Enithera species, came from Texas. I don't know what species it is, but here is a nectar guide. Here's a stigma. Down in here is a hole that leads to a tube where the nectar is produced. Digitalis, or foxglove, has these dots saying, follow me. Up here at the very end, you'll get your reward of nectar. Now, nectar guides can be for nectar or pollen or any other kind of reward. We just lump them all into nectar guides. Now, bees see UV light. They don't see red light, but they see UV light. So here is an Indian blanket, Gaillardia pucella, and this is the way it looks to us in color. If I photographed it with black and white film, this is what it would look like. We see red. We see the dark regions as being where the red is. But if you're a bee and you don't see red wavelengths of light, this would be what it looks like. You can put a filter on your camera that knocks out the red light. However, their vision is skewed, so they do see UV light. And if you put a UV filter on there that allows the UV light to come through, this dark region is signaling to the bee, this is where your reward is. Now, recently, some people have done some other techniques to try to get color photographs of maybe what a bee sees. This is a Monarda. They called it a bee balm. It's not a Monarda fistulosa, but they're saying this is what it looks like to a bee. I'm having a little problem with that because things are kind of reddish, but maybe that's what the UV looks like to a bee. The reddish looks this way to a bee. But you can see light areas, you can see where the anthers are, and you can see how the flowers look very different from the bracts beneath them. This is Calthea palustris, or marsh marigold. If we were going to look at it with our eyes, with our color vision, everything would be yellow. You wouldn't see any blues. You wouldn't see any reds. Everything is yellow. But this is supposedly the way the bee sees it. It takes you directly into where the anthers and the stamens, the stamens and the pistils are. So this is where the reward is. This is where you need to spend your time and energy. Pollinating flowers and look at what it is they need to be to killer. Bats kind of eat more insects than flying foxes. Flying foxes are actually large bats, but they tend to eat more fruits and flowers, but both of them are capable of pollinating. This is a bat on a cactus flower. This is a flying fox going for a bombus flower. What is it they need? They're flying at night, so they need light or white colored flower. They are big animals, relatively. For a flower, they're a big animal. So you need a big, sturdy flower. You don't have to have landing platform because they can hover. And very often you have parabolic sort of flowers with lots of stamens. All these stamens back here is the stigmas and styles. But this parabolic structure will bounce the sound wave off of the flower back to the bat so that it knows where the flower is. And a good, strong fragrance can help at night. Bird pollination. There are basically two kinds of birds that pollinate flowers. Those like the hummingbirds that can hover, and those that don't hover. Now, the interesting thing about birds is they have the same color vision we do. They can see red. So very often bird pollinated flowers are red. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing they go to. They can see all the other colors. They're just smart enough to know that the bees are not visiting the red flowers. The bees can't see the red. They're avoiding the red flowers unless there's some UV nectar guide on them. A hummingbird doesn't need the landing platform because it can hover. You get a long tube with nectar because you've got a long bill. There is no bee that has a tongue that long. You also need a fairly sturdy flower because you've got something that's going to shove its head and its long beak down the flower. So you want a good hefty flower. This is a sunbird. They need landing platforms. You do not find sunbirds in Oklahoma, in North America. These are tropical birds, but they, like the hummingbirds, go for the red flowers because they know that the bees can't see them. This is bird of paradise. It is bird pollinated, not by hummingbird, but it's evolved with the sunbird. But you have the stem right here and back in through here, there's nectar. So it will thrust its head in here, thrust its head back in here to get the nectar, and the pollen will come off the anther. Now, there are other vertebrates that do pollination. There are lots of rodents. In Australia, there are rodents that will pollinate proteas, such as we've got here. There's even some lizards. There's some other mammals that kind of get near flowers that do occasionally pollinate, or they were going for the nectar, so they need something to drink, they'll pollinate a flower. But these are all tropical species. You're not going to find this in Oklahoma. So let's move on to the invertebrates. Beetle population. Beetles are probably the oldest pollinator around. Primitive flowers have lots of flower parts, lots of petals, lots of sepals, lots of stamens, lots of pistils. You've got this nice open area with a smorgasbord in there. It does what's called nest pollination. It just walks there having a good, kind of like a pig, gets in with its food, has a big meal, and then leaves. Other insects, such as ants, other kinds of beetles and things, can do the same sort of thing. This is an ant on an avocado flower. Avocado flowers are the littlest, ugliest sorts of things. We've got sepals. It's an incomplete flower, but it's a perfect flower. And stamens and the stigma. But this ant is gathering the pollen off of the avocado flower and thereby pollinating it. Fly pollination is kind of unusual. It tends to be where they're not on islands where there are not lots of other insects. You get this reddish brown color to the flowers. And they smell like rotting meat. This is a Stapelia. I had a colleague at East Central that had one growing in his office. And every time it flowered, it got moved to the botany lab because he didn't want to smell it. It's not a really pretty plant other than the flower. So he was missing out on the fun part of it, but he just didn't like the smell. I had one on my front porch in one year and it attracted flies. This is a bee fly on a rose. I know it's a bee fly, not a bee, even though it's got the stripes, because I look at the eyes. And it is acting like a bee in that it is getting pollen off of the flowers. So it is not doing the typical fly pollinated flower. It is mimicking a bee, and in both its morphology and its behavior. Butterfly pollination. Butterflies can't hover, so they must have a landing platform. They have a very, very long bendable tongue, a proboscis, so they need tubular flowers, and they tend to like plants where you get a whole lot of flowers together. Here is the proboscis on a butterfly. We're on a zinnia. And you can see there are lots of flowers here on this zinnia. Got a good landing platform. A swallowtail on phlox. You've got a long tube with nectar. There's no bee that has that kind of mouth part. So the butterfly has free reign on a phlox flower. Here's a monarch on an asclepia. The neat thing about asclepia flowers is they have a very, very small slit that you have to have that flexible long proboscis to get down in there. So any butterfly can actually get nectar from a milkweed flower. It doesn't have to be a monarch, but no bee, nothing else, no other insect is going to be able to navigate that kind of slit. Moth pollination is very similar to butterfly pollination, except moths fly at dusk and at dawn. So you need a light colored flower, white, pale yellow, and it needs to have a strong fragrance to help the moth find it. This is Korean honeysuckle, light colored. You've got a tube, landing platform. There's the stigma on the style, anthers on the filament as the moth lands on it. A butterfly could during the day, but as a moth, it sticks its proboscis down here and gets dusted with pollen, carries the pollen to the next flower, pollinates the stigma. If you've ever noticed, been around honeysuckle a lot, you'll notice that the smell is at dusk. There's not much smell during the day. That's how it's advertising to the moths that I'm around. Bee pollination. You need a landing platform. Bees can't hover. Bees will go for nectar and or pollen. And very often bee pollinated flowers, those that are pollinated only for bees, are sized for the particular type of bee. This is a bee on Chicoreum intubus. It's an Apis mellifera. It's probing down in there. It's getting dusted with pollen while it's getting its nectar. Here is a bumblebee on the desert sage, Leucophyllum fructescens. Notice it's sized where it fits the landing platform. It can go down into the throat of the flower, following the nectar guides, and get the nectar. Now, a smaller bee could get in here. It might not pollinate, but a bigger bee, because it will slip between the stamens and the pistil, but a big bee, perfectly sized for this flower, getting whacked on the head by the stigma. Stamens were on the sides. This is a smaller flower, has a smaller tube. There would be no way a bumblebee or a carpenter bee could land and stay on this lower lip. That part of the flower would collapse with the weight of a big bee. Bees do collect pollen also. This is a hibiscus. There is nectar down here, but there's also pollen that it can scrounge around in here and collect. So it's digging around, getting what it needs. It's a big flower, can handle a big bee. Now, when I look at this bumblebee, and this is a bumblebee, I see two spots. Now, Jose Montevilla talked about in his survey of bees at the zoo that he had found the two-spotted bumblebee that had not been reported. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm misidentifying that, but I photographed this 2 summers ago in the Cleveland County Master Gardener's demonstration garden. So I might have, I don't think that's part of a leg. I'm thinking that's a two-spotted bumblebee. I'm going to have to send this to him and find it. But this bee has a pollen basket full of pollen. So it is on this Amorpha fruticosa or false indigo bush, collecting the pollen to take back to its hive and make a food for the next generation. Now, one of the fun bee pollination syndromes is the buzz pollination. This is big bees, and you have a stamen with very large anthers with a pore at the end. And if you vibrate this anther, pollen comes pouring out onto the abdomen of the bee, which it can then collect and use for food for its brood. The Primula media or shooting star, these come from Pontotoc Ridge, have that kind of anther and require buzz pollination. Wasp pollination is just weird. This is a brown turkey fig. It's actually self-pollinates, but it's the only fig I had a picture of. There's a little hole in here. The wasp crawls in, the male wasp crawls in, finds the female wasp who just emerged from the eggs laid inside here, fertilizes her. She lays eggs next generation. The males will leave, go find another new fig, but the females spend their whole time inside of the fig. So if you're eating a fig from the Mediterranean, you may be getting some extra protein. Another interesting thing is pollination in the sunflower family, the Asteraceae. This is an inflorescence. There are tons of small flowers here. If you cut it open, this is a flower, this is a flower, this is a flower. You have the ovary down here, some modified sepals. The petals are fused, 5 stamens, and growing up in between the stamens is the style and the stigma. Pull a couple of these off so you can see this styles. The stigma is hidden by these fused stamens. But notice how the style curves back. If a member of this family is not cross-pollinated, many of them, the styles will curve back, touch the stamens, and then self-pollinate. So if you have one dandelion in your yard, you're going to have a whole lot more. Orchid family has weird pollination syndromes. Orchids are very interesting in that they have 3 petals. One which is highly modified. There are 3 sepals at the back, 3 petals. And they have this highly modified petal, such as in this cultivated Phalaenopsis. This one, you can see down in here, here's this highly modified petal. And you've got a guide. This is called the labellum. This is called the column. And the bee is forced in underneath. If you dissect the column, so here we're going across the labellum, here's the column, there's an anther cover right here. Back in behind here is the stigma. It's a whole big surface area. And under this anther cover are 2 pollinia. So the first bee goes in here, goes after whatever reward, nectar or oils or proteins. When it leaves, it rips off the anther cover. The next bee comes in and it sticks to the anthers and pulls off these little packets of pollen grains called pollinia and goes on and hopefully leaves the pollinia behind in the next orchid it visits. Now, some orchids are just downright mean. They have a type of pollination that we call pseudocopulation. These little orchids look like wasps or bees. You can see how you got little wings and a body, maybe a head region up here. There's the pollinia anthers. The bee comes in here, tries to have sex. The male bees emerge before the female bees or wasps. They go out looking for their mate. These guys put off pheromones and look like the female bee. And so it tries to have sex with it. It's not very successful and gets whacked with pollinia as it leaves. Goes on to the next one and it deposits the pollinia in the next one. So this poor male wasp or bee just gets frustrated and gets no reward. So highly deceptive. I have always wanted to see a bee orchid. Amy Butho bought one and had one in the terrarium at the Berberium last spring, fall. It was quite fun to see, but I really want to see one in the wild. Unfortunately, they don't grow in Oklahoma. So now when you're out in your garden, having a good time with the genteel company that you enjoy sharing your garden with, stop and realize that there may be some indiscreet behavior going on around you. And that concludes my talk. We got Adam. Adam's gonna.
I'm here, Ramona.
All right.
Thank you for a great presentation. I saw a lot of familiar things.
Yes, I'm sure you did.
Yeah, a lot of those I remember seeing when I was in a Ron Turo class in grad school. So, we don't have any questions that anyone has posted yet. And so I thought I'd give it a little bit because we do have a little lag between the live presentation and when it's streaming. So we'll see what happens here in the next minute or so. But Patrick, did you have any questions for Ramona while we had her on the line still?
I did not. I think that was, again, thank you very much for a stirring rendition on Sex in the Flower Bed. It was certainly well thought out. Your slides were great, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to give the presentation to us.
Yeah. We did get a comment on the website from Esther. She said that was great with 3 exclamation marks. So there are others that are actually watching this, Ramona. So that's good. It's not just me. It's not just me and Patrick. So that's good. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Esther.
All right. Well, I think that will finish us up for this presentation. Again, our next one will be, I think it's November the 5th on Thursday evening. The benefit of watching it live as opposed to coming back at a later time is that you'll be able to ask the presenter any questions that may come up. So keep that in mind as you're planning your schedule for early November, and we hope to see you then.
Yeah, and I just saw a post from Lynn. Lynn asked if it was going to be available.
Who loves my presentation.
Yeah. So Lynn wanted to know if there was going to be available later, and it will be. Also, that Lynn James said she loved it, and Debbie Drinko said, "Thank you, Ramona. So informative and educational." So, thank you for all our folks who chimed in on the live stream, and we'll catch you next time. Take it easy. Thank you, Ramona.
Bye.